capacity building in development, it's not a new topic. It's a topic that have created a lot of headaches, and despite of the intervention we have made in development, it still is a fundamental issue. What is capacity and how to create capacity in a sustainable way? Of course, we are talking about human capacity. We are talking about the human factor. Either individuals, like creating engineers, or as a collective, how a particular society can raise the bar in its social consciousness so that things can happen in the right way. I must say that my great imperative is to find a balance between knowledge, content in life, and container. And I think now most of it is content. There's so much content in my life, in your life, that we don't know what to do with it. And this is the great challenge of the Aquarian age, that actually you have more knowledge than you want. I mean, you go to Google and you put any word in Google: human rights, sustainable development, capacity building, market, any word, and Google will give you thousands of citations as to what to do with that word. So we don't have a crisis of content as we used to have, 50 years or 100 years ago. So how do we create this balance between content and container? And I think I see capacity building as the means, the instrument, the practices that we have to go through, and the programs to expand the container. And here the container is two or three folds. One is the human container, and we have done little for that. We have done more on the second container, which is organizational container, how to make larger universities, better technology for information transfer. And then we have community container, which is how to create institutional capacity at the local level. And I believe that they are interconnected, and we are not going to be able to expand, for example, the capacity of communities in a sustainable way if we do not create individual capacity at the human level. I think people are fighting sometimes for issues that, there is not enough information to really fight, but they're already fighting. This demands several shifts. The first shift is that capacity, and sustainable capacity, has to be either a variable or the objective function of a given project or a given program or a given plan or a given exercise at the national level or the local level. In the past, institutional capacity was not part of the dialogue, so institutional capacity was violated. How it was violated? For example, you bring tractors that are 2011 to an area where nobody talked to the farmer, nobody taught them how to deal with these tractors. And this tractor is not just a matter of driving them or being mechanics of the tractor, but the impacts it had on the communities by saving labor, by creating unemployment, by creating a new social structure, those who have tractors, those who don't have tractors, etc., etc. There are tremendous impact of technological change that were not really embedded into the rhythm, into the timing, into the melody of that society. So institutional capacity was violated and gave rise to many institutional capacity building projects. So it was like a business. Let's break down the institutional system to have projects that will build it up. I think now we need to reverse this. I think we need to bring sustainable capacity as an essential ingredient before we do anything else. And the analysis, just the analysis of what type of institutional capacity is needed and how sustainable it should be before we bring programs will be the key to the success of the program. I remember in my last years of my career, I even found out that communications as an activity became pre to any project I was involved. In other words, we will bring journalists, anthropologists, and all communication specialists to try to gather information on whether the community will be even interested in that project, whether the community will accept the project, or how this project will actually impact on their daily lives. And this was fundamental in the success of the project, to have a period of conversation, of communication, of dialogue on institutional capacity, on sustainable capacity, through communication at the time. So I would say that there is no success in development if there is no sustainable capacity. And so let's not keep breaking down the capacity that exists or changing it, substituting it by a Western way of understanding of capacity. So if you go to Vietnam, the first thing you need to do is to understand what they have as capacity, and maybe it's not the material side, maybe the human side, maybe the spiritual side, maybe the tradition side, maybe the culture side, maybe the family side. I do not know. But clearly the way a family in Vietnam works in business is very different from a family work in Latin America. So you see many Chinese stores also in Latin America now, that the whole family works there. You know, it's all integrated. The grandparents take care of the children at home, so they don't break down that capacity. The youngers are selling and taking care of the store. And so there is some balance to avoid the breakdown of capacity. While in our societies, we're breaking the family down. Not only the husband has to work, the wife has to work, the children have to work because of economic conditions. So the family as an institution breaks down, and then you see that in the longer term, they don't have any more business. You know, they become actually proletariats of the system. So in sum, when we talk about sustainable institution building, sustainable capacity, we are talking about how to expand the container before we throw things to this container. It's like having a cup of tea of this size and putting 2 liters of water in it. It's just not going to hold it. So whether we boil less water or we expand the size of the cup, and both aspects of it are part of the discussion on sustainable capacity. So let's have sustainable capacity as a central issue of socioeconomic development. Human security, big issue in the world. I think we have all seen how the world has changed in the last 20 or 30 years. War, conflict, there is more normative stages one has to go through by just flying, going to an airport. People feel that they're humanly insecure, but nobody really is able to articulate what this means. But we are just feeling that to go even across the street, we might be attacked by thieves. The whole world is in a lot of turmoil now, particularly after September 11. You know, and I believe that this issue of human security is very important because we should address it in a way we don't violate human rights of people. You know, we might be constraining people's freedom or doing other things that go against the grain of our democracy and so on and so forth. The basic fundamental aspect of human security many decades ago was given to the army or the police. You know, essentially was an issue of how large the police was, how do you defend your country. So the whole debate on world security had to do with the protection of your government, the protection of your nation. But now people are saying, particularly the World Commission on Human Security, you know, that came from Japan. Japan was very instrumental in creating this commission. They're saying, yes, it's important that governments are involved in human security, no doubt about it, but human security is also beyond governments. We need to go up to the community. The community needs to have as a value, in a value system, security. Security needs to be ingrained in it so that we don't destabilize socially or otherwise the fiber, you know, of that society. So human security is being moved, you know, from government top down into bottom up. I think both ideas are very good. I think we have to have both, but we need to have an institutional framework, an organizational framework that is capable to unify these two approaches. Otherwise, anarchy might come. For example, there is an Occupy movement in the United States. There is many countries are experiencing the outraged people. The outraged people are in a sense coming bottom up, okay, in reaction to how top down is being affected them. So where do they meet? Where do they get together and resolve the issues that they are raising? It's not clear. Some of them are saying our society is sufficiently advanced so democracy can take care of it. So we'll have elections, we will elect new government. Well, some countries have been able to do that. But it's not clear that every country that have these outraged people will be able to do that, because either democracy is very weak, the establishment might not desire to have any elections or any form of democracy, or the international community might be, constraining the move toward democracy because they don't like the outcome. You might have an election as a result of a movement that is looking for more security, but the election might bring the people you don't like. So the question, what are we willing to accept the result of this form of people-based security or not? I think we need to grant to the public that security is not just about some invasion from someone else. I think there is an issue of food security that we cannot forget. People need to know that tomorrow they can eat. There is environmental security, ecological security, that the environment is not going to destroy ourselves. There is health security, that we are not going to be subject to so many diseases and unable to address these diseases because either we don't have income or we don't have access to health. So security is a concept that permeates everything. But security, even if it permeates everything, has not been part and parcel of the macro debate in a society. Usually people talk about security when local violence rise up, something that nobody likes. But at that point it's too late, because that form of insecurity has been created because some of the people who are violent because their security at their level of income, at their level of poverty, it's practically nil. They don't have food security, they don't have employment security, they don't have environmental security, and so on. A long time ago, the World Bank did a study on voices of the people, of the poor people. So the title was Voices of the Poor. And they asked, what was the most important set of things for you in the list of priorities? And they say, opportunity, security, and empowerment. I think the list was empowerment, security, and opportunity, something like that. And it's essential to listen to the voices of the poor. It's not my voice interpreting the poor. For the poor, security is fundamental, but it goes with empowerment and opportunities. It is impossible to maintain sustainability in security if there are no opportunities, because people have no way to expand, no way to integrate, no way to grow. But also they say, if you want security and opportunity, we need to be empowered. You cannot have a society that is disempowered and be secure. It's impossible. If a population, a shanty town, for example, has no empowerment, there is no way that this will be a secure place. And you will find out that actually it's a source of insecurity because of drug abuse, because of assault, crime, and so on and so forth. So we need to think about security as a dimension of human life, not as an activity. Some people think that is more prison space, it's more number of police, or is more judges and so on. No, it's that plus, and the plus is that security permeates every human person in the world. Finally, I think that it is relevant to say here that the approach of either government or community is incomplete. And there will be no security unless there is self-security, unless someone in itself feels comfortable in the societies. That means identity, that means participation, that means respect, that means self-realization. We need to recover our countries, we need to recover our security, and the best way to recover our security is through citizenship. I think we need to have clear signals that we are citizens of some place, and as citizens we have rights and responsibility, but we have rights. And as long as people are not empowered with those rights, we will always be insecure, because they will look for channels, to break down the system in some particular way. So just to sum up, I think top-down was okay, is complemented by bottom-up, but now we need to wrap up around security, citizenship, which give the essence for the expression and the enlargement and nurturing of our democracies. There is a major preoccupation about the results of development. Billions of dollars have been spent in the name of development or poverty alleviation or environmental management. And most people say, where this money is allocated properly, where the resources that were engaged into the solution of a given problem actually effective in resolving that problem. Many years ago, we had very elaborate statistical methods to follow through, and even a logical framework at one time, to find out whether the intent of our actions attain the objectives of those actions. So we did a lot of surveys, if it was an agricultural project, we look at the agricultural output, we try to predict a number of things with the statistics. But I don't think that type of monitoring and evaluation that was behind that was sufficient to capture the reality of those development interventions. So I went into ex post evaluation, which is the second part, to look at completed operations, and I look at the bundle of around 2,200 projects and look into them from the perspective of sustainable development. And I found out that around 650 of them had something said, something stated in terms of sustainable development. The others, the evaluators who did the evaluation report, never look into the problem of sustainability. And I found out that there were many ways to project this term sustainability. One was, this project is not sustainable because there was no money for operation and maintenance, for example. Another project is not sustainable because we exhausted the fisheries. We had a technology that was too large in relation to the fish stock, so we caught too much fish, and then the fish population disappeared. Other people would say this project is not sustainable because there was no participation of the people. Simply it was a good idea, but nobody explained it to them, so the community became anti this development intervention. So I took all of these statements, and wrote them down. Every statement that has to do with sustainable development, I wrote it down, and then there were thousands of statements, I use a principal component analysis, to look at frequency distributions of this statement, and it came out revealing something extremely important, is that we could group essentially sustainability under 5 or 6 forms of capital. So one was all this statement that had to do with physical capital. The roads were not good, there was no enough of this or that for the infrastructure of development. Then we had many statements on financial capital. Like I said before, this project never succeeded because the government didn't put its counterpart fundings, or the lending was not correct, or whatever. So we had all these statements, line up into physical capital, financial capital, human capital. There was no sustainability because people were not trained enough. There was not enough capacity building for them to go with the complexity of this project. Then we had natural capital, which is the example of the fishery. Then we had institutional capital, and this is related to organization, is related to incentive structures, is related to the law, is related to norms and regulation, and so on and so forth. For example, this project failed in sustainability because the normative system was so complex that it didn't enable it to really function. Too many rules, too many restrictions. In the end, people did not do anything with it. But then we had cultural capital, you know. This project didn't fit the community, you know. Okay, we wanted them to produce onions, but they don't eat onions. So they wanted to produce wheat. And we said, no wheat, because that is, it's not productive enough. Or we brought them forms of housing that had nothing to do with the way these indigenous people live. So actually some of them burned the houses as fuel wood rather than using it for housing proper. Or there was a contradiction between the use of infrastructure and their animals. You know, maybe the animals did not fit within this environment and they preferred to be themselves in junction with the nature rather than adopting this thing. So the cultural capital was important. And finally, a spiritual capital. There are values and belief systems that people have. There is identity they have that this domestic development intervention violated, and therefore the project was not sustainable. So I found out that we had these forms of capital that needed to be in balance, and we also found that these forms of capital were interrelated. In other words, physical capital and financial capital were interrelated, but also physical capital and environmental capital, natural capital were related. The case of the Northwest Highway in Brazil, for example, that you put a physical capital into the environment and then major destructions, you know, take place in the forest, in human capital, in local communities, in cultural capital with indigenous people, and so on and so forth. So we tried to create monitor and evaluation systems, you know, that were capable to, in advance, not afterwards, to predict quickly what to do during the project implementation so that we could correct, you know, against the set of objectives and values that we had for those projects. This was a very, very complex job because you needed to know a lot about development, a lot about statistics, you know, and a lot about evaluation. And until now, I haven't found too many people actually who are able to do this. So one option is to shift the burden of monitor and evaluation to the actors. You know, let the actors do it, their own form of evaluation. And this has had some success in some places, but in other places it's not been successful because the complexity of the intervention is such that people actually don't know how to operate. I have seen this operated successfully in projects of justice systems reform. For example, there are areas where people don't know their rights, but they cultivate the land because they've been there for many, many years. So how do you settle rights? And a good way to monitor and evaluate the transfer of rights is done by the community, because you don't want to impose those rights, because the traditional rights system might not be in line with the formal rights system. So it's much more effective that they monitor in the transfer of rights as a community than we monitor and evaluate the transfer of rights. So we did bulletin boards in the community, so they will publish, you know, they will give, let's say, a month or two for people to claim those land. And if they were not claimed, in principle, you will accept that that land belonged to the family that participate right now. So I think the future of monitor and evaluation is by integrating the actors in the planning phase, in the design phase, in the appraisal phase, and in the implementation phase, so they know how to direct their own vehicle, their own instrument, and so on and so forth, rather than having monitor and evaluation from outside, from a different perspective than the human reality of those who have been affected. So that's the future of monitor and evaluation. The topic of sustainable development can be looked into from many different perspectives. Most people think that the topic is just about ecology and environment. But actually, even to talk about ecology and environment, there are many ways to understand this. One way is to think about sustainable development as a next step to socio-economic development. If one look at the sequence, the first part of the sequence is economic growth, how fast an economy can run. The second one is who benefits from the economy, which is socio-economic development. And then the third one is how long this will last, whether this pattern of growth and development leads to sustainability. But actually one can look at it in a very different way. For example, one can look at sustainable development as a debate on value systems. Whether the values of the market, whether the values of nature, whether ethical values or moral values should guide decisions regarding our future. And in this sense, the reason why sustainable development can be seen as a value system is because the early debate on the ecological movement was to claim that the market gives values that end up punishing, destroying the environment. So many people will say a tree has not only a value in terms of use, which is what the market actually prices, but a freestanding tree, might have a value, an ecological value in terms of its DNA, in terms of its capacity to provide shade, in terms of regulation of winds, and many, many other things that a tree does, in addition to the spiritual value of a tree. But there is another way that concerns us today, which is to look at sustainable development as a human right. In other words, that people have the right for a clean environment. People had the right to live in societies that are sustainable. But this right is not a direct right, it's usually a derived right. And so the creation of this environmental right is based on the jurisprudence of many other forms of rights. For example, the right to life, the right to information, the right to clean water, the right to housing, the right to food. Many of these rights that have a jurisprudence that is understood, is accepted, and there are many international treaties on these rights, are providing a support for an overall jurisprudence in the maintenance, the management, the appropriation, and the use of our natural environment. And I think that it's very important for people to see sustainable development as a debate on rights, because rights are always accompanied by responsibility. And the question we are asking all the time is, what is the responsibility of someone who destroys the environment? For example, a factory might pollute a river, maybe this is an outcome of production, but the question is, who is responsible for cleaning this river? And most of the time, there is an imbalance between those who create the environmental problem and those who pay for the environmental problem. I was in a region in Portugal that it was a fruit producing region, and they use fertilizer, pesticides, and hormones. But in my little farm, I had organic production, and I ended up paying with my own health because of the pesticide, because the pesticide flies in the air. So they gain from producing fruit, they sell the fruit, they make money, but they're not paying the abatement and the health cost that I go through because of their actions. So there is a need for a normative system that will regulate and at least make explicit who is the source of this pollution, and then who has the responsibility to deal with that pollution. So should I pay for my healthcare system, or should the fruit producing people pay for my health? Naturally, the best outcome is that my health is not affected by anyone, but we live in an interdependent world. The same thing happens, with regard to global warming, the production of CO2. Some countries produce more CO2 than others, but the destruction of the ozone layer doesn't occur exactly where the largest production of CO2 is. So the question is, who pays for that and who has the responsibility? So because rights and responsibility go hand in hand, the debate on the rights to the environment have been fueled by very interesting discussions on the responsibility to take care of the environment, or clean the environment, or repair the environment, or bring the environment back to where it was. In addition to that, there is a question about the extent to which human rights exist for future generations. We know very well that the earth needs to be kept at least in the same way we receive it, or better. This is not the case now, because the total is less than the sum of the parts. You know, we are consuming more minerals, we're destroying more, you know, land, we are exhausting and depleting more biodiversity resources. So there is a big question as to whether future generations have rights. They are not here, so how could they have rights? But there is a general consensus now that future generations do have rights, and basically we need to make sure that we do not constrain, we do not limit the ability of future generations to live in this planet. So who has the responsibility? There must be a normative system, a set of rights that is capable to address that issue. Last but not least is the fact that as we doubt or discussed whether future generations have rights, there is another discussion taking place for the last decade, which is whether nature has rights. You know, whether nature is a live entity, and if it has rights, then the question is who will protect those rights and who will make sure that those rights are in place so that nature is respected in the way it should be. We have one case which is very interesting in Ecuador, you know, the constitutional change that gives right to nature. And that implies that citizens, as well as government, need to have a special behavior so that these rights are implemented. So it's not that easy anymore to download your waste in the river near your house, because actually someone will come up in this normative system to say, look, you cannot pollute this river, the river has rights, and it's not only you have rights, but there is a balance here between human rights of human and rights of nature. There is another debate on human rights, or rights in general, and sustainable development, which has to do with the forms of protection of a natural resource so that the tragedy of the commons doesn't take place. Most of the time it is argued that we exhaust the natural resource beyond its critical point because there are no incentives to frugality. In other words, there is no incentive to non-use. Most of the incentives are for more use, more growth, more this, more. There is no incentive for less. So there are certain situations where the sustainable development objectives are not attained because we don't have a system of rights that eliminate, you know, the causes that are being created in terms of resource use. This is the case of the tragedy of the commons, where the people don't have incentives to take the sheep out of the prairie. So it was suggested in 1968 by Garrett Hardin that we should privatize the commons, in other words, to allocate property rights to it. The same thing at all levels, in urban areas, how to allocate land rights so poor people have better environment. They say that people who don't have rights to the land will not have incentive to preserve the land. They will just use it and abandon the land. This is happening in the Amazon, this is happening in many places. So rights seem to have an impact in human behavior in relationship to the environment that is affected for the assignment of right. And there is a long discussion about private right, collective right, secondary rights, informal rights, and so on. So it's important that we understand the relationship between rights and development, human right and sustainable development. And I would suggest that actually we will never be able to attain sustainable development without a proper set of rights, a proper set of norms. I think the best news of today is that we have the World Engagement Institute. And I like to say that the title of the Institute in itself is providing you with a very beautiful formula as to what the Institute is all about. First, it's about the world. There is one world. We live in one world. This is our world. We all need to take care of this world. So the Institute foundation is the world at large. It's not just one person, one group, one country. The Institute acknowledges interdependence all over the map. It acknowledges intersectoral, it acknowledges intergenerational, all forms of interdependence of the world level. So that I like. But I like even more to talk about engagement. I think this is the time in history where we cannot disengage or be indifferent to what's happening with the planet, what is happening with societies, what is happening with countries, what is happening with communities. So when you combine engagement, which is an active process, it's a form of behavior that connects you with the reality of your town, the reality of your country, which connects you with human reality. And I think that this combination of world engagement is beautiful because sometimes it's easier for people to engage in local things only that are very, well circumscribed around you. But it's impossible in the longer term to be successful in local action without global and global without local. So this is something that the Institute, it's well defined by putting this title, the World Engagement Institute. So the essence is that engagement comes from human beings. And this gives another dimension of the Institute, which is an institute that is humanistic in nature and is looking for benefiting humanity and not just benefiting some entity, atomized entity in the world. So I like to see that the Institute has been created and that the Institute is engaged into human reality. The drama is, of course, how you will intervene in this human reality, with what instrument and how. Because human reality is so large, so complex, that it's impossible for any institute to do it alone. So I believe that the comparative advantage of this institute is, number one, in a vision. How should we see things? And this is wisdom. This is not just mechanical eyes or ideology or politics looking at a human reality. It's wisdom. How do you put at the disposal of this interpretation of reality your wisdom, your experience, the experience of many people, the experience of many groups in society, including academia, including politicians, including NGOs, including governments, etc., etc. Second point is that once we create this vision, it is very important not to go just straight to action, but understand that we need to know the mechanics of thinking. And most of the time people are looking for the right answers. The Institute is engaged because it's also interested in the right questions, and I think this is more important than the right answers. If you can have the right answers to the wrong questions, and then we are nowhere. So if you have the vision and you have this intent clear, this way of thinking clear, in a holistic way, in a complete way, in a right way, if you want to say, then you have accomplished a lot. The third is how you use a vehicle, language or technology or communication, the right discourse, about this vision, this human reality, and the interpretation of the human reality. And I believe that the Institute can make a tremendous contribution because most groups are either engaged in very well-defined, narrowly defined topics where they are in compartments, nobody's talking to someone else. I think somewhere there has to be an integration. And no doubt that there has to be substance in the integration, but I believe that at this day and age, 2011, there is too much substance and little integration. So the time is now to integrate so this vision is collectively understood. Where the world is going, why are we in crisis, why we still have 1 billion people going hungry every night, Why do we have, 80% of all consumption being in the top 20% echelon of income, and only 1.5% consumption in the bottom 20%, the poor? Why these disparities? So the Institute will have the hands full, and I believe that it is fundamental to create a matrix of action, not just silos of action. Secondly, I think we need to create a matrix of actors, and this is very important. You cannot look at this matrix like I know what it should contain. I think you need to provide room for other actors to come in and be a good listener and a good transformer of these actors or the messages of these actors, so that everyone understands why such a country is going in this direction, another country is going even in an opposite direction, or why there is no change in certain societies, why there is change in other societies but it's not the right type of change, and so on and so forth. So it's not only a matrix of action, it's not only a matrix of contract, but it's a matrix of actors. Finally, I believe that the Institute needs to be progressive and not regressive. That is to say, we need to project reality for the year 2050 and not to have the ideology of 1950. I think the many people feel very comfortable in a world of the 1950s, and as long as nobody shakes them, they might be hiding in the academia, they might be public officials in some government, or it might be in a church, or it might be in another organization of our society. We cannot wait. There is an urgent imperative now in the world, So time is now. Changing the world is not for another few years. We need to change the world now if we're going to see positive changes in the future. We cannot be on the sidelines of human reality. There is a crisis, yes, but we are the crisis. The crisis is not there. It's part of ourselves, or part of our DNA, this crisis. We cannot let the world collapse to build it again. I think if the world collapses now, it will be extremely difficult to rebuild it, because it's ingrained in the system. Money, wealth, materiality, material gains, and so on and so forth. So the Institute can be a catalyst of how to create this change, how to become an instrument of human transformation, for the better of humanity. And last but not least, I think the Institute, by having the word world at the beginning, needs to not only look at the individual perspective on matters, but to the collective perspective. And I think the challenge for humanity is not about individual materialism. I think we're very good at it. I think we're every day on the market, in shopping centers and everywhere. Where we're failing is on finding a way to collective engagement. The individual engagement is not all perfect, but one can do something about it. But how do you do collective engagement, where two countries say, yeah, we're going to go for peace, not for war? That takes time. Many countries are going to say, okay, we're going to go for sustainable civilization and not for an unsustainable civilization. How do you do that? And here is when the Institute must understand its value added. That is not only on this individual program by program success, it's a collective success, so the total in the end is larger than the sum of the parts.